This just in. Broken arguments are still broken. Deconverted man, what's broken about it? I'm so glad you asked. This video is from Chris Boyer. What is the cosmological argument for God's existence? Does God exist? The description of the video pretty much sums up the video, but that would be no fun just to read that and point out the flaws here because he says all this stuff in the video. So it's time to play the video and then point out the logical fallacies.
The cosmological argument for God's existence is really an argument that has two versions, the contingency version and the temporal version. The contingency version seeks to provide a sufficient explanation for the existence of the universe, while the temporal version seeks to provide an explanation for the cause of the universe. The contingency version of the argument goes as follows. Anything that exists has to have an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Now, if the universe were eternal, like scientists used to believe, a sufficient explanation would still need to be provided. A reasonable question to ask would be, why is there something rather than nothing? Since the universe does exist, it has to have a sufficient explanation for its existence.
Okay, so the syllogism of this would be something like anything that exists has to have an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Even if the universe was eternal, it still needs an explanation. The universe has to have a sufficient explanation for its existence, and then the conclusion is not yet stated. There's a problem with the first premise in that you're essentially saying that everything or anything has an explanation, and either that explanation is what I would say a tautology. It exists because it has to. It can't not exist, which you say as nature. Or there's an external explanation for it. So it either has to exist or it doesn't have to exist. And so it now exists and there's some other cause for it. Of course, why and how we would know that something exists because it just does is a giant question that's not being answered here. So what if the universe's nature is that it has to exist at some point? Maybe there's a point where it doesn't exist, but that its nature is that it has to exist. So it comes into existence because that's the nature of the universe. And that would be the end of that. And you can't say, well, what's the explanation? The explanation is that the nature of the universe is to pop into existence. And there you go. So the explanation is that it just is. It's just that's how it goes. Is that really an explanation as we've come to understand the word explanation? Because when you have a tautology, it's just kind of a brute fact. 1 + 1 is 2. That's just the way it is. That's how it works. There's no rhyme or reason to why that is. You can ask how, or you can ask questions about it, but there's a limit to those questions. Eventually you just get to the point that it's a brute fact that just the number one is the number one because we said it was the number one, and that's the way it is. And in other languages, and say in Japanese, ich is number one. So there you go. Well, why? Because it is. That's the way it is. It's a brute fact. Is that an explanation? Well, I guess it just depends on how you view the word explanation. So there might be a better wording to use here, but I think we can forgive that a bit. But to say it's either it has to exist or it doesn't have to exist, basically, right? I don't think the whole universe being eternal needs anything, because whether the universe is eternal or not would be irrelevant. Because you're saying that either it has its own nature explains it, or its own nature can't explain it. So even if the universe was eternal, you could still say that didn't explain it because the nature of the universe is not sufficient to explain it. I don't know how you would know that, but that would be somewhere in the argument. So you would just get rid of the whole eternalness or non of the universe. And then to say that the universe has to have a sufficient explanation for its existence, I don't know why sufficient is there. Just say it. You don't even need to say this because you already have said anything that exists has to have an explanation. So you're just kind of being redundant at this point. So basically, this whole thing could be summarized by saying, what's the explanation for the universe?
The temporal version of the argument goes like this. Anything that begins to exist must have a cause. Since the universe began to exist, the universe must have a cause. Notice that this argument would not apply to a universe that were eternal, because that would imply that the universe never began to exist. The argument only works if the universe began to exist. Since modern cosmology and astrophysics tells us that the universe did have a beginning, it follows that the universe must also have a cause.
Why won't the Kalam just die already? Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe begins to exist. The universe must have a cause. How do you know? You see, the problem is premise 1. Anything is a superlative, which means you are claiming to know about everything. And the only things that we can talk about are the things that we have observed and tested. So we can't say everything. We could say at best, as far as we have observed, things have a cause. Although we would have to put a asterisk there and say, well, maybe not in quantum mechanics, because their things are popping in and out of existence, and there might not be any cause. It's just that's what they do. It's their nature to come into existence and then to fade from existence, and that's how that works, which goes back to the other argument where you said, you have to have an explanation for things either by its own nature or by some other force. Well, what if it's just the nature of reality that the particles of quantum come into existence just because and fade out of existence just because, and that's what they do. And they came into existence and at some point hit each other, and that's what started the whole process that eventually became the universe that we know and love. How would you know that that's not the case? What methodology is being employed to say that can't have been the case? We don't know. We have no idea. We run out of an ability to do science at the T1 point of the Big Bang. And to say that science has said that's a beginning of the universe, well, that word doesn't even make sense. Because if there's no time, then to say begin is incoherent at that point. But, that's just a few problems with this argument. There's other problems, like that this argument doesn't hope to even lead to anything other than saying, well, the universe has to have a cause, and then saying, okay, that's nice, and what's the cause? We don't know. Even if you agree with the argument, it doesn't lead you to any specific God, particular God, and defenders of the argument will say, well, but that's not the point. It's part of a cumulative argument, yada, yada. the argument's flawed from premise one, so it already fails anyways. But even if it didn't fail, it failed because an argument shouldn't have to have, like 20 arguments to get to the point. Oh well. Moving on.
Nothing begins to exist without a cause.
How do you know that? Hey, how do you know? How do you know that? Did you examine everything? No, you didn't.
And the universe is no exception. The cosmological argument is one of many arguments for the existence of God that has been popularized by many philosophers and scientists alike. It is an argument in the realm of what we would call natural theology. These types of arguments are not intended to get you to the Christian God per se, but they will definitely get you headed in the right direction, far and away from atheism.
No, they don't, because they're flawed in many different respects. One assumes to know everything about everything. That's the Kalam. We don't know about everything. We only know about the things that we've observed. The other one was so badly formatted and stated that it's really difficult to even begin to analyze the other argument that you gave, because you didn't even state the conclusion of that one. But in either case, it's nothing more than saying, I want the answer for this. And there has to be an answer for this. And then here's some more arguments that eventually lead to the particular type of God that I want to be the answer to this. We don't know what the answer is at all. We have no idea. And to make these leaps of assumptions about it doesn't get us anywhere. Now, atheism is simply not believing in any particular God whatsoever. One could be an atheist and still be spiritual, whatever that means, or even attend religious services, because there are now atheist churches and stuff like this, secular churches. But there is a deep-rooted need for religion to propagate itself. Otherwise, it dies out. Christianity, Mormonism, Hinduism, etc. all need to acquire members in order to continue to be. Now, if tomorrow we all woke up and all religion was instantly and magically forgotten somehow, all the writings of religion just vanished off the earth, science would still work. People would eventually make up a new God and make up a new religion about it, because people's brains tend to want to have these sort of explanations. We're pattern-seeking creatures. It's what we do. But those gods would be just as made up as these gods. If there is to be a coherent argument for any particular god, it's not this argument. It's been demolished and destroyed and debunked many, many times. I do not comprehend why Christian apologists continue to use it, despite the fact that it does not function. It is an illogical argument, and it's not a scientific argument. It's not even close to being correct or in line with science. And of course, it ignores the potential counterexample of quantum mechanics. So, apologists, find a new argument. Fix the arguments. We've heard them. We want better ones. We want ones that work. And you haven't changed or come up with anything new. This just in, broken arguments are still broken. And unless and until we have arguments that aren't broken, we must continue to be skeptical of the conclusions.